Margaret Thatcher's first term as Prime Minister stretched from 1979 to 1983. It was a most difficult time with recession, unemployment, race riots and inflation at home, with great tensions of the Cold War to boot. Her job approval fell to 25% by 1981, which represented the lowest level ever recorded for a serving Prime Minister. That all changed on the 2nd of April 1982, when about 1,000 Argentinian soldiers took over the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic Ocean. After the bloody victory was secured, her approval rating shot up, and so did her support in Westminster. This led directly to her landslide election victory of 1983. In January 1981, Ronald Wilson Reagan became the 40th President of the United States. Like Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, he faced problems like economic recession and unemployment, but unlike the British PM, President Reagan had won the 1980 election by a landslide, which meant he had the political support to push through many of the policies he wanted. His economic strategy became known as Reaganomics and involved lowering taxes, increasing military spending while cutting discretionary spending, which includes things like education, social services, health and justice. It also required a huge increase in the US national debt, which tripled during his presidency. Key issues like lowering taxes and public spending were fully implemented by both leaders in time, which led to widespread criticism on both sides of the Atlantic. One fierce opponent of Ronald Reagan was the Democratic leader of the House, Thomas Tip O'Neill. He said, "When it comes to giving tax breaks to the wealthy, the president has a heart of gold." In October 1986, President Reagan met Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in a famous, not to say legendary, meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland. Here, the elimination of all strategic nuclear weapons, including submarines and bombers, over 10 years was proposed. Interestingly, Jacob Weisberg, writing in The Atlantic on New Year's Day 2016, says this was proposed by Gorbachev, but Richard Aldous says it was proposed by Reagan. Whoever made that incredible offer, when Margaret Thatcher heard about it, she was horrified. The problem was that the Soviet bloc had a massive advantage in conventional forces. The only reason the Soviets hadn't advanced beyond established borders was because of the genuine threat of nuclear retaliation. Europe simply could not repel a full-scale Soviet invasion otherwise. Europe and Great Britain were on the front line. America was not. America has never been on the front line in modern times. This legendary advert appeared in June 1981. Greg Field describes a huge celebration at the York factory in Pennsylvania, followed by a triumphant ride by Harley-Davidson's new owners to Milwaukee, some 900 miles away. Although it was a wild party that lasted 4 days apparently, it didn't escape the attention of these gentlemen that they were obscenely in debt. This, plus what was effectively a global recession, and a company whose reputation was in tatters, according to Willie G., all helps explain why AMF had been willing to sell for what constituted a bargain. Through the euphoria of 1981, the reality was that sales had dropped to their lowest level since 1973. This, coupled with the recession, ensured that Harley made colossal losses that not even the mass redundancies of 1982 could alleviate. What apparently saved the motor company were huge improvements in efficiency. Today, just-in-time parts supply is standard within the motor manufacturing world, and it arrived at the York plant in 1982 courtesy of the newly promoted Vice President Tom Gelb. Vaughan Beals reckons these improvements saved the company $20 million, which in turn helped persuade the banks not to foreclose on their loans to Harley-Davidson. But with sales collapsing, Harley had to do something, and the focus fell on the Sportster because 1982 just happened to be its silver anniversary year. The Sportster was 25 years old. To celebrate, Harley offered special anniversary editions of both models with the A designation. This helped the XLS and the XLS-A sell just over 2,000 units, but overall, Sportster sales figures fell to under 8,000 for 1982. Again, there were only very minor changes to the model line, with two slightly less minor exceptions, the frame and the compression. Alan Girdler says that the 1982 frame represented the best frame the XL family had ever had because the cast iron steering head was replaced with steel, although Donnie Peterson says that it was just the cast iron junctions that were replaced. Either way though, everyone agreed the new frame was stronger and lighter. Although this change wasn't visible to the naked eye, the wheelbases had been extended a fraction. The 1980 XLH had a 58.5-inch wheelbase, but the 1981 model had a 60-inch base. The XLS went from 59.6 inches to 60.75 inches. The other, slightly less minor change was the thicker head gasket. Although a very minor, not to say tedious, detail change, the effect of that change was more important. It reduced the compression ratio from 9:1 to 8:1, which therefore reduced power to about 50 horsepower. This retrograde step was required to meet emissions regulation, but it compares horribly even with a 1962 Sportster. This was an 883cc bike offering 55 horsepower, while the 1982 Sportster was a 1000cc bike, so 20 years newer, but now offering 5 horsepower less. The Anniversary A models offered no improvements over the standard bikes other than the fancy 25th anniversary paintwork, which was described as dark maroon and pewter. There was also some detailing on the timing cover and under the headlight. Chapter 6 of Alan Girdler's superb Sportster book begins on page 108 and finishes on page 121. Nearly all of this chapter is solely focused on one single Sportster model, the fabled XR1000. He begins the story describing it as a bold move that failed. With problems mounting for Harley-Davidson, their need to bolster sales and profits was greater than ever. Their proposed solution was a two-pronged attack. The first prong was an attempt to make a genuine, high-performance version of the Sportster. In previous videos, we've seen how the importance of racing influenced Harley-Davidson, even though American motorcycle racing is largely irrelevant to the rest of the world. Still, then as now, one bike inspires and excites a certain type of Harley devotee like no other. This is the XR750 flat track racer. The XR race bike first appeared in 1970 where, according to Alan Girdler, it blew up early and often. It was made in tiny numbers and sold sporadically through the 1970s, with Sportsterpedia reporting final sales of 180 in 1980. Although this bike is often mentioned with the Sportster, certainly in all American histories, it's not a Sportster, and it never was. Alan Girdler notes that it shared almost no parts with the XL models. Still, the XR750 has become the iconic American dirt track racer. One dealer in Holland is currently asking an impressive £87,500 for this 1975 fully faired TT version. Harley's plan for the 1983 high-performance Sportster was simple enough. Nail the XR750 heads onto an XL1000 engine and squeeze it all into a standard XLH frame. And it all had to be achieved with no money and inside 6 months. Alan Girdler says the project had all the earmarks of a jam session. Naturally, the XR frame was lighter and smaller than the XL frame, but the XR all-aluminium cylinder heads were enormous and they wouldn't fit inside the XL frame. Without funds, Harley had to farm out much of the design and production work. The results were predictable. The huge high-performance engine produced 71 horsepower, which, compared to a Honda CB750, which produced just 4 horsepower less even in 1969, 14 years previously. Fuel consumption must have gone through the roof with the 2 huge carburetors, and the tiny petrol tank only held 2 gallons, less than 9.5 litres. The huge twin exhaust was mounted so high that excessive heat caused problems for riders, which was only exasperated by the small saddle. According to Cycle World at the time, the bike was also so poorly balanced it had to be ridden with a list a few degrees to the right. While it may be considered a classic today, the short-lived XR1000 is also one of the 3 ugliest Sportsters ever created. While aesthetic valuation can only ever be subjective, looks are not what killed the ill-fated XR1000. In effect, it was the other new Sportster model which formed the second fork of attack for 1983, the XLX. This effectively sounded the death knell for the XR Performance model. With catastrophically falling sales, Harley knew they had to address the issue and somehow create high sales volumes quickly. The premium XR1000 was never meant to do that, but the XLX was. It's a simple reality of commerce that anything will sell if the price is low enough. Harley-Davidson took this maxim to heart with the new XLX, but this masked a new way, one that Harley pursues with merciless vigour today. This new way was copied from the car makers who offer a low base price but then fleece the customer with lots of costs of extras. The downside is clear, but the upside means that more people can afford a Harley-Davidson motorcycle if the initial price is as low as possible. I, for one, subscribe to the new way, and then bellyache about it when I need different handlebars and longer cables. This new, cheaper Sportster is more properly known as the XLX61, because a 1,000 cubic centimetre engine equals 61 cubic inches. It was offered at just $4,000. To achieve this low price, Harley stripped out everything they could from a standard XL model, so the seat was a small solo seat, the front mudguard was cut down and the petrol tank was an even smaller 1.7 gallon or 7.5 litre design. The instrumentation was reduced to a minimum, just the speedo, with a flat track style low handlebar. There were no fancy finishes, minimal amounts of chrome, and the exhaust and handlebars were black. 1983 sales were quite good, with nearly 5,000 XLXs sold. The XLX helped Sportster sales increase slightly, with 9,756 units selling, which was still only 1,000 more than 1982. The XLH and the XLS models benefited from an increase in compression ratio thanks to a return to the thinner head gasket. This was coupled with newly designed pistons and an ignition system with a microprocessor control module, presumably helping emissions, but the XLH and the XLS sales were still very low. XR1000 sales, though, were terrible, with only 1,000 units being sold. Although there were problems with the bike itself, it was the price that guaranteed its failure. It cost $7,000 compared to the XLX at just $4,000. The XR1000 soldiered on into 1984 with sales figures falling to just 759, but at $7,000 it never stood a chance. The 1984 Sportster lineup remained with the same 4 models. Sales continued to increase marginally to 10,600, meaning that another 1,000 units were sold year on year. The XLH and the XLX were doing acceptably, but the XLS and the XR were falling by the wayside. Changes to the XL line were again minimal this year, with a larger single front disc brake replacing the twin discs previously fitted, and the old-fashioned generator finally being replaced with a more modern alternator, or stator apparently. The base model XLX was now offered in 2 colour options, not just one, vivid black or candy red. For 1985, nothing changed for the venerable Sportster, although the XR1000 was dropped. Sportster sales plummeted to just 6,500, their lowest level since 1967, with the XLS registering just 616 units sold. The XLX61 saw the largest drop in sales, prompted no doubt by the price hike to $4,700. However, demand alone was not the sole reason for these sales declining. Harley were actually holding back production for 1985 because 1986 was going to be a rather special year for the Sportster. Even before the end of the 1970s, Harley-Davidson's parent company, American Machine and Foundry, were in big trouble. This, in turn, obviously meant that Harley were also in big trouble. The pressures on Vaughan Beals and the Harley management were intense and prolonged. Each year it was as if AMF was raising Harley-Davidson higher and higher up the proverbial wall towards the high shelf where the potential energy stored would eventually become unsustainable. This was not just an academic exercise. It was bean counting run amok. This was AMF's long, convoluted, and potentially catastrophic raising up of an entire motorcycle company in the despairing hope that it could generate enough financial energy to save itself. However, the economic and political realities of the early 1980s ensured that the odds were heavily stacked against AMF and, therefore, Harley-Davidson. High unemployment, interest rates, and deep recession meant that, according to Willie G. Davidson, the market was evaporating, resources became even scarcer, and employee morale was at an all-time low. While the AMF bean counters, like CEO Tom York, were only counting the beans, dollars, fortunately for Harley-Davidson, the brave group of managers headed by charismatic Vaughan Beals saw past the beans, way past. Vaughan Beals himself, while speaking fluent bean, was clearly and lucidly understanding how the monstrous energy stored up in the raised-up motor company could catapult Harley-Davidson into the 21st century. Willie G. says, Vaughan was a good engineer and a true believer. He came up with the idea of buying Harley-Davidson from AMF. This was not an easy sell, but his enthusiasm was infectious. Each individual had to make a decision based on how it might affect his family financially. Where the bean counters only saw numbers, these 13 brave managers understood the whole emotional side to Harley-Davidson. Our brand, our relationship with riders and dealers, and the styling of our motorcycles. They are what make us strong. Willie G says his own decision was fully supported by his family because, like Vaughan Beals, he says, I have faith in Harley-Davidson. And therein lies the difference. A bean counter can never have faith. All historical decades are unique and mark significant and subtle changes. From my solidly Western worldview, the uniqueness of the 1980s were entirely forged by three remarkable individuals: Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev. The first and longest serving of all these leaders was Margaret Thatcher. She was the trailblazer, the catalyst for what followed, positive and negative. Although her first time as Prime Minister was unremarkable, the Falklands War in 1982 changed all that, catapulting her to political superstardom and forever forging her as the Iron Lady. But it was the special relationship with Ronald Reagan that helped them both forge themselves into history. Like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan believed in low taxes, strong defence, low public spending, and the unswerving commitment to defeat communism, especially the Soviet Union. But unlike Mrs. Thatcher, President Reagan did not see nuclear weapons as the way to defeat the evil empire, or even as an effective deterrent to war. After President Reagan's talk with Gorbachev in Reykjavik at the end of 1986, when the President agreed, or suggested, depending on whose account is most accurate, removing all nuclear weapons from Europe, the relationship was at its most strained and, indeed, was permanently changed. Mrs. Thatcher wrote, I never ceased to believe in the importance of nuclear weapons as a means of deterring conventional, not just nuclear war, the one issue I knew I could not take the Reagan administration's soundness for granted. The second most serious threat to their enduring friendship and the Anglo-American special relationship was the Falklands War. While the ice-cold bunch of lambs seemed unimportant to Ronald Reagan, to Margaret Thatcher, and even to Great Britain, it was and remains a part of Great Britain, however far removed geographically. Thus, the invasion revealed General Galtieri to be an international bully violently oppressing 2,000 British citizens. Mrs. Thatcher tried to emphasise this to President Reagan by asking how he would react to someone invading Alaska, or, one might add, Hawaii. But US priorities in South America meant they were willing to support a regime, any regime, as long as it was not communist. Supporting Britain against Argentina might jeopardise US foreign policy, such as it was in South America. Therefore, they would not support Britain if it went to war over the Falklands. In the end, it was Argentina's refusal to accept any US negotiated solution that left the US with almost no choice but to support Mrs. Thatcher's and Britain's war. I think these two issues left Margaret Thatcher feeling betrayed, though I've never read that she used this word. Either way, she did feel that the transatlantic special relationship warranted President Reagan's full support on both issues by and of itself, and many in Washington agreed. "Don't mind all that crap about self-determination. We're with you because you're British," declared the feisty Democratic Senator for Delaware, Joe Biden.